Chapter 11, Section 1. Um, the Greeks are going to make many contributions to world civilization. Greek efforts to do their best is going to lead to a golden age of Greece. Some also call this the classical age of Greece. This was partly because of their religious belief. The Greeks felt the gods were honored by imitating them. The greater the skills, the more the gods were honored. If we're going to take a look at religious practices, most Greeks held very similar religious beliefs. Although there was no single Greek religion, each city-state worshipped its own gods. You would have local officials in charge of public feasts and sacrifices. Families prayed together and sacrificed to the gods. Oracles were persons who it was believed could speak with the gods. Priests and priestesses were oracles. The most famous oracle was at Delphi. The oracle at Delphi is going to give advice to many people, like a psychic, and the advice was usually in the form of a prophecy. A prophecy is a statement of what might happen in the future. And usually the oracle would give a prophecy that wasn't quite clear. It could mean more than one thing. So then it was up to the person to decide on the meaning of the prophecy. So Mount Olympus is the home of the gods and the goddesses. And let's take a look at this video about Mount Olympus.
One of the most famous places of Greek mythology is Mount Olympus, known as the dwelling of the gods. But that was not always the case. The great mountains found all over the world are known as the daughters of Gaia, the earth goddess. After having been released by Kronos, the powerful Titans made the mountains their own thrones. But the rule of the Titans would be challenged by Zeus, who after having released his brothers from Kronos' stomach, unleashed war upon the Titans. Zeus and their allies turned Mount Olympus into their headquarters, while the Titans opted for Mount Orthrus. After having defeated his rivals, Zeus transformed Mount Olympus into the residency of the gods. This new generation of deities became known as the gods of Olympus. The palace of the gods was located at the peak of Mount Olympus. To access it, one had to go through the clouds. There was a gate watched by the Horae, also known as the Seasons. They opened the gates of Olympus to the gods and their guests. Many gods and immortal beings lived in Olympus, but not all of them had in their residence. Poseidon lived in his submarine palace, Hades had the underworld, and Apollo lived in the Far East. Even though they didn't live in Olympus, these gods had an unrestricted access to such locations. In Olympus there was a great room, beautifully decorated with crystals, a work of Hephaestus, who was a magnificent craftsman. The grandiose banquets of the gods were held there, dripped in nectar and ambrosia. The goddess Hebe and Ganymede were the ones accountable to serve the gods. There was also a room where the assembly of the 12 Olympian gods took place. Sat on their thrones were Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Athena, Demeter, Hermes, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Apollo, Artemis, and Hestia, who then gave her place to Dionysius. These assemblies talked about the most different issues related to the heavens and the earth. In one of those meetings, the dispute of Athena and Poseidon for the city of Athens was settled. According to most traditions, Hades did not have a permanent seat in the assembly. However, he could participate if he wanted to. Many don't know, but Mount Olympus does exist. It's located in the region of Thessaly and is Greece's highest mountain, reaching a height of 2,917 meters. The mountain is located inside a forest reserve with rich flora and fauna, packed with endemic species. In other words, some animals and plants can only be found there. There are tourist tours, for the most prepared ones, who want to reach the top of Mount Olympus, and who knows, perhaps you may meet one of the gods of Olympus reigning over the world. I hope you enjoyed knowing more about Mount Olympus, and if you have a chance to go to the Palace of the Gods, who is the god that you would like to meet the most? And see you in the next video.
There were 12 major gods and goddesses for the Greeks, and they weren't necessarily viewed as terrifying or all powerful. They were viewed as family who experience emotions. Each god had a specific duty. The Greeks approached the gods with dignity, not fear. Greeks believed in the worth of an individual, self-respect. The Greek gods were shown to be living like rich Greeks lived, usually taking part in everyday life of Greek people. The most important god was Zeus. The Greeks built temples to honor the gods. And inside of the temple, there would be a statue of the god that was being honored. And there'd be an altar in front of the statue. The temple was believed to be that god's home. People didn't enter it, but they would worship outside of it out of respect. The Greeks would honor the gods with festivals. Two very important contributions to the world are going to come out of these festivals. One was theater, and the second was the Olympic Games. The Greek athletic games are going to combine religion, sport, and music. Herodotus, the father of history, first read his account of the Persian Wars at the Olympics. And it's going to involve thousands of people from all around the Mediterranean. The four main games that the Greeks held were the Olympics, the Pythian Games, the Nemean Games, and the Isthmian Games. The games at Olympia were the oldest and most famous of the games. The games at Olympia honored Zeus, and they were held every 4 years. But as time goes on, the role of religion is going to go down in these games. It begins at mostly local events. These games begin mostly as local events lasting 2 or 3 days. Originally, they only had dancing, running, and wrestling. But eventually, they grow into these week-long events involving people from around the Greek world, and they weren't just about the religion anymore. They would actually announce a truce before and during each festival. So that way, visitors could travel safely to Olympia. With all warfare being in a truce, safe to travel. So wars are suspended. Armies were prevented from threatening the games. Any legal disputes that were going on were suspended. And you couldn't even carry out the death penalty during the games. The truce was usually followed. But there is one example when it wasn't. There was a city-state that attacked another during a truce, and they were fined 2,000 minae, 2 for each soldier involved. A minae is equal to 100 drachmas. A drachma is 1 day's work, or price of a sheep. So this fine was about 200,000 drachmas, okay, or equivalent of about 200,000 days of work, or price for a sheep. As far as the athletes go, the requirements for the athletes, you had to be of Greek blood, you had to be a free man, and you could not have been convicted of murder. The athletes pledged to play fair. They pledged that they had trained faithfully, and cheaters were fined. And they would use this money to build statues of Zeus. Eupolis of Thessaly is the earliest recorded cheater, and he was accused of bribing boxers. Callippus of Athens bought off competitors in the pentathlon. And they would usually, the athletes would arrive at the site 1 month early. The only acceptable excuses for lateness would be illness or pirates or storms. They wanted to make sure, they got there a month early. They're ready to compete. Usually the poor didn't compete, though, because most of the poor couldn't afford to be away from home for that long. These are not going to be amateur athletes. They weren't paid by the games themselves, but usually they were paid by others. When you won, winners would receive a wreath made from an olive tree. And the hometown of the winner would usually reward the victors. For example, if you won the games and you were from Athens, Athens basically had a deal where you would have free meals for life. Most athletes competed nude, which could not have been entirely comfortable. Women did not normally compete in the games. There were a few exceptions for some equestrian events, but typically there were no women competing. Spectators would arrive in huge numbers to visit Olympia for these games. Most slept outside under the stars. The wealthy would have these elaborate tents, and the wealthy would try to outdo each other. You would have merchants and craftsmen and food vendors selling things. Married women could not watch the games. The first Olympics took place in 776 BC. It was a local one-day event, and they made sacrifices to Zeus, and they held running events, and Corobius of Elis was the first ever Olympic victor. So he's the first one ever to win the Olympics.
The ancient Greek Olympics, 776 BC to 393 AD. The modern Olympic Games started in 1896 by Pierre de Coubertin, a French baron. After the French defeated the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, it was thought that the French youth didn't have enough physical training. This formed the idea of creating the modern Olympic Games when archaeological research discovered new facts about the ancient Greek Olympic Games. It was between 1875 and 1881 that the ruins of the site of the ancient games were uncovered. The Olympic Games began in ancient Greece in July 776 BC at Olympia. As a festival with athlete events staged to honor the god Zeus, the Olympics also united individual Greek city-states and colonies in competition. The first Olympic Games happened at a time when there wasn't a sense of being Greek. This common identity only came up after the Greco-Persian Wars of 492 through 449 BC, so everyone who participated in the first Olympic Games did not identify himself as Greek, but as a citizen from the city he had come from. It isn't known why Olympia was chosen as the site for the Games, despite that the fact Mount Olympus was clearly a sacred place for the Greeks. Because it was a sacred place, it was chosen to hold the Games, and that's why a great part of the Olympics was occupied by religious ceremonies. In anticipation of the Games, messengers were dispatched to announce a truce, or ekekairia, among all Greek city-states and colonies. This temporarily halted all wars and facilitated safe travel to Olympia. The Games were held over the course of 1 day until 684 BC. At that point, they were expanded to 3 days. During the 5th century BC, the Olympics were further extended to a 5-day event. The Olympics were held every 4 years, from 776 BC to 393 AD. There were 293 consecutive Olympic Games. Before the Games began, an opening ceremony would take place. there was a procession of all competitors to the home of the competition, Olympia. Once they had arrived in Olympia, all participants would swear an oath to the crowd and to the gods that they would abide by all rules and compete against each other with honor and respect. 100 oxen were also sacrificed to Zeus in the most important religious ceremony of the Games. The only event held at the first Olympic Games in 776 BC was a foot race called the Stadion. The race was 600 Greek Olympic feet in distance, one stade. The first winner was Corybos from the city of Elis. In 724 BC, a second event, the Diabolos, was introduced. Twice as long as the Stadion, a distance race, the Dolichos, first appeared at the 720 BC Games. The Dolichos varied in length anywhere from 7 to 24 stades, but the most common distance was roughly 11,811 feet, or 3,600 meters. The track was made of sand with grooves indicating start and finish lines. An additional running event, the race in armor, was added in 520 BC. Interestingly enough, only men were allowed to participate for all the events other than the equestrian events. Participants competed completely nude. This allowed for freedom of movement and no contraband on one's body. Wrestling was added to the Olympics in 708 BC, as was the pentathlon. The latter included 5 events over one day: jumping, discus, stadion, javelin, and wrestling. The jumping event consisted of participants jumping as far as they could while holding stone weights, which they would throw towards the end of their jump in an attempt to propel them even farther forward. Music also played as they jumped. The discus throw in the ancient Olympics was similar to the freestyle discus throw of today. Originally made of stone, participants would throw the discus as far as possible. Later versions of the discus were made of iron, lead, or bronze. Javelin was performed with a leather strap and thrown skyward at the same side-on technique as today. Wrestling was one of the more popular sports in the ancient Olympics, as it was a highly valued form of military competition in ancient Greece. Competitors would wrestle until one admitted defeat. In 688 BC, boxing was introduced. The boxing event consisted of 2 participants hitting each other until one was knocked out or admitted defeat. The competitors would originally wrap their hands and wrists in cloth straps to strengthen and steady their fingers and hands. But eventually, these straps evolved into a tough leather that would often leave cuts and scars on the faces of boxers. A blend of boxing and wrestling, the pankration, appeared in 648 BC. The only restricted moves in pankration were biting and gouging. The first equestrian event was added in 680 BC. The Tethrapon, a 4-horse chariot race, was accompanied by the Keles in 648 BC. The Keles involved a rider on horseback. During the 5th century BC, a 2-horse chariot race, the Synoris, was added as a race for trotting mares, the Calpe. A mule-led chariot race, the Epony, was run for only a short time during the 6th century BC. Olympic athletes from the Greek colonies on southern Italy, Sicily, and Asia Minor arrived at Olympia 1 month before the Games to train for their events. Upon arrival, they had to declare that they had been training for their events for at least 10 months. Professional and personal trainers accompanied aleptes, oil massagers, in getting athletes ready to compete. Historians believe that since the early part of the history of the Olympics, that athletes were very specialized, at least from 700 BC on, because of how little evidence there is on competitors winning more than one type of game. Winners of Olympic events received crowns made of olive leaves, or kotinos, and branches from a sacred olive tree called Kallistefanos. These prizes were thought to be magic, at least in the first days. They also returned home as celebrities, heroes in their victorious representation at the Pan-Hellenic event. Once victors had returned to their hometowns across Greece, they were hailed as heroes and were celebrated by lavish banquets and even tax exemptions. However, their greatest prize was the historical immortality they achieved. All Olympic events were overseen by judges trained at Elis. As the administrative heart of the Olympics, Elis supervised all aspects of the game. To compete was a way to pay tribute to the gods. The competitors swore by Zeus that they would respect the rules of the games and fair play. There were formal rules to every event, and in the event of a violation, athletes were fined, flogged, or simply excluded from the games. One type of punishment was to pay fines, which could then be used to set up statues of Zeus. Spectators traveled from throughout the Greek world to watch the Olympic Games. From 776 to 550 BC, the Games were held at the sanctuary to Zeus in Olympia. Later, spectators and attendees, mostly men, gathered at the stadium, a site that accommodated more than 40,000 people by the 2nd century AD. Women were not permitted to compete in the Games, and married women were barred from attending the Games under penalty of death by being thrown off a cliff. When Greece became part of the Roman Empire, the Olympics expanded beyond Hellenic confines. Banned by Theodosius I in 393 AD, they were again shunned by the Roman ruler Theodosius II in 426 AD. Natural disasters and plundering invaders wreaked havoc on Olympia for the subsequent centuries, and so it wasn't until 1896 that the Olympic Games were reinitiated in Athens, Greece.